So next one I want to talk about a little bit is combination of things. But first is curves. We have a new set of curve tools in here: create curve, grab curve, and smooth curve that we can use to kind of create paths on the surface. Now when you create a curve, let's go ahead and select the create curve tool. You can go ahead and just drag a curve across the screen, and that curve is sitting there in screen space. And so you can move the model behind it, and you can kind of use this curve to either run a series of stamps or a stroke of paint across that curve, and it'll project onto the model. You could do the same thing for any of your sculpt tools. So you can select the sculpt tool and then right click, say stroke on curve, and have it generate a sculpted detail on the surface. Let's go ahead and undo this real quick. And by the way, when I create these curves, let's go ahead and just drag a curve on screen. You can see that these curves will show up as nodes in the outliner portion, the object list of Mudbox. So you can see there's a curve there. Let's undo that. It also works in a mirrored mode. So if you have something like this where I'm going to draw and you can see how this mirrors on the other side, I want a symmetrical pattern of some sort, it does work as well. Now if you're starting inside of the object, we can just do this as a single curve instead of mirrored, and just kind of focus on maybe a detail on the surface, or maybe I want to kind of pick up a line on the character and I want to generate a detail along that curve. You can see that this curve is now a curve on surface. It sits on the surface. You can also export these to Maya, which is quite nice. Or you can bring in a model from Maya, generate the curves on surface here, because this is actually a little more intuitive in terms of the way painting is laid out, and it does paint across multiple surfaces. So if you have multiple surfaces sitting on your model or in your scene, you can paint curves right across all of them, and then of course bring that back to Maya. So let's go ahead and turn on mirroring and kind of pick up a curve that maybe starts over here and kind of turns out and kind of follows that detail, and maybe you want to build or create some sort of detail along that curve. And in this case, we'll use painting to do it. Let's go ahead and dock these back where they belong. Actually, let's go in here and just reset the layout real quick. There we go. We'll go to Paint Tools, and let's go ahead and lock the layout just so that we don't do that again. And we're going to use a paintbrush here, and we can use whatever color. I'm going to pick something. Let's say we'll use white, whatever. And so in the image browser, we can now pick, let's say we'll pick a red skull. So if you paint with white, you paint a red skull, the skull is going to be red. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to use this as a stamp, attach it to a brush. I'm going to go ahead and control the size of the brush, which will control the size of the stamp. And then we can say stroke on curve. You can see that as I do that, you get a very high repetition of these skulls along these curves. So what I want to do is I want to increase the stamp spacing to something much greater. And now we can go ahead and run that. You can see how that generates these skulls on the surface of my character. And so in this case, that's what's sitting on this paint layer right here, and I can now go ahead and just kind of say let's multiply this, or maybe once it's in that mode, I can just use the up and down arrow keys to kind of step through all the options, all the modes, all the blend modes that I also have available in Photoshop. There are 27 of them. And so that's a one-for-one, the blend modes in Mudbox with the blend modes in Photoshop. So that's just a quick way to edit that. Now, if I wanted to, I can also go in here and let's say we'll delete these curves. We're going to go in here. You can see these curves show up, curve and curve 1. We can just go in here and say delete them. There's one, and let's delete the other one as well. And let's draw a new curve on surface. If I have a curve that has a lot of detail, if I want to, let's say I don't want to be very accurate, maybe I want to generate something of a necklace around this big fat neck, I'm going to go ahead and just turn off mirroring and just maybe start painting here. I could just click drag, you can see how that works. And it's not very accurate. And let's say I'll make this less accurate on purpose. Also, as soon as I get my cursor close to the end of one curve, it picks up an orange circle there, indicating that it will connect your next curve segment to the previous curve. So that means that I can kind of run this all the way around this fat neck of this character. Let's go ahead and do something like that. And then maybe I want to go ahead and close this by having this connect and then this close. Then you have some tools in here for grabbing. I can go in here and grab this curve and kind of place it, move it, slide it across the surface exactly where I want it. And a smoothing function here that allows me to very quickly kind of smooth out any kind of inconsistencies or small details in the curve that need to be cleaned up. Something like that. All right, so at this point I'm ready again to go ahead and paint. So let's reduce the size of that brush to something like this, and then right click stroke on curve. And let's go ahead and make sure that we have a paint layer created or selected. Otherwise paint's not going to show up, and stroke on curve. There you go. So that's a quick way to kind of generate these kinds of details along a predetermined path on your model. Okay, the other thing that's kind of nice is that if I have, let's say we'll have a curve like this, and we'll generate some details in kind of a similar fashion. And let's go ahead and undo that and mirror this so we get something similar like that. I can go into my fall off editor, select a paint tool, and let's say we'll pick something different. Color code is a little different. So there's our paint. We have our fall off editor. We can select the fall off for any of our stamps, and if I turn off stamps and stencils so that we just work with a clean brush, you could see that if I now go in here and say stroke on curve, there again, let's go ahead and turn this on. So we have a layer to paint on. We basically get solid dots that way. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger. I'm going to increase the stamp spacing even more so you can see this. Okay, that's good. What I want to do is kind of modify the fall off and show you the new fall off editor. So in addition to what I just did, one other comment related to curves is this feature here called snap to curve, and right now this value is set to 60, meaning that if I'm over here I can paint and do whatever I want, but as soon as I get within a proximity of a certain value, you can see how that brush kind of snaps over to that curve. That proximity is determined by this value, so if you set this value to a much lower value, you can see that it happens much later, and so you can kind of control how sensitive that snapping function is. Alright, so with this brush selected, I'm going to go in and create a new fall off. So we'll add a fall off, and let's say we'll grab this and load this into our brush. We'll open it up in here, and let's not move that. Let's go ahead and move that back and kind of look at tear off this fall off editor. So if I wanted to go in here and quickly plot in some points, you used to have to go in here and say right click insert point. Now I could just go ahead and click drag, and kind of point this, pull this down, maybe pull this down over here. Let's go ahead and get rid of this one. And just kind of paint this, you know, in terms of the points that I'm creating. You can see you can create very complex shapes very quickly. And so let's go ahead and add a few over here, maybe add one over here, kind of something like that. Once this is done, let's go ahead and close this, and we'll make sure that this is, whoops, let's go ahead and make sure that we save this, something like that, and something like that. So we'll say store to our fall off shelf. There it is. Let's close this, make sure that this is selected, and if I paint this now, you can see that it kind of generates these targets, blue targets. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of that brush a bit, right click, stroke on curve, and now we get this. And so that's kind of a quick way to generate targets along. Let's maybe increase the stamp spacing just a little bit like that, and get a little bit of overlap, but you get the idea. So it's a quick way to modify the fall off of your brushes on your model. So let's go ahead and get rid of those curves. There we go, and move on to the next part of this story. All right, so before I forget, one more thing is that, of course, along these curves you can also generate vector displacement maps, or vector displacement that, you know, could be very sophisticated kind of sculpted details that you want to add along a path. Okay, so in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let's in the object list just kind of clean this up. I'm going to select this curve and get rid of this, and maybe jump into layers. So I'm going to create another paint layer here, 4K paint layer. That's fine. There we go. And we can go ahead and delete this one. We don't need it. We can delete this one as well. Okay, and what I want to do is I kind of want to throw in some basic color. Let's go and throw in something fairly Let's go in here and grab something like this and add paint without the fall off. So let's go ahead and select the solid shape, and we're going to turn off stamps and stencils. And then let's go solid in here. Now you can see that I have to do a lot of switching of settings. Like I have to turn off the stamps, I have to turn off the stencils, I have to select the default fall off, etc., and so on. And so this is something that's new in 2013 as well, is this reset button, which resets your brush to a basic default brush with a basic default color, and it kind of guarantees that you're working with something default, which is really kind of a nice thing to be able to do. And go ahead and just kind of apply that to a separate layer, and that separate layer will contain all of our layer masks. So let me just recreate this real quick. Something like this, maybe expand this here a bit. And so right click, we can say create new layer masks. Sure, that's great. It's going to show an inset layer. You can copy and paste this layer, and if you were to go ahead and maybe drag this into here somewhere, it actually uses that layer mask as a normal paint layer, because it is a normal paint layer. So let's go ahead and undo that and move it back into the paint layer 3 here, or let's just create a new one. There we go. I'm going to select the stencil that I want to use as a layer mask. So we're going to go ahead and select that zebra kind of pattern. And I'm going to load that as a stencil. It'll show up in here. I'm going to select the projection brush and maybe just flip this around like that and kind of align the spine of that zebra with the spine of my character. And then let's go ahead and turn off mirroring, because I want to pick up the asymmetry of that texture and kind of imprint it on that color. And so we have this isolated on this particular mask layer. So you can turn the mask on or off, or you can turn the layer on or off, either one. And then of course you get a transparency for both, right? So you can go ahead and control the layer transparency, or you can go ahead and control the mask transparency, which will have two different effects. If we go back to our image browser and load something like, let's say, a ramp, and let's go ahead and create another layer mask. There we go. We can now go ahead and just kind of rub this into the surface, and you can see that the black will go to nothing. And it's also limited to the size of the swatch, which is easy to fix, because we can just go in here and use tiles and repeat this to a point where we're covering the entire color that we laid down initially. And then maybe you want to go in here and do this one more time. And we're going to run this ramp in the opposite direction. And let's go ahead and create another one of these. And there we go. And now we can go in here and just kind of do the opposite of what we just did. And the reason why is because all this can kind of work together. We could say, let's go ahead and have the mask 3. We'll select that, and we're going to go ahead and multiply that times the mask below. So now you get a little bit of both. And if I select mask below that, and we'll multiply that times the one below, and so now we get a multiplication of all three, seeing that it gives you kind of a fading in all direction, and that zebra pattern is only visible in the very center. Okay, so the other thing that you can then do is, just like before to all this, we can then go back to an adjust color kind of routine and say, maybe I want to, in this case, I don't want to do something like, I don't want to convert it to a black and white. I just want to shift the hue on the surface. I could do that. And I can maybe reduce the saturation or increase it, or we can introduce more black or not, right? And so all these things can be modified after the fact, or you can just generate curves for this and just kind of manipulate this in a very specific way, whether you want to do that and apply that to RGB, or maybe to individual channels or value, or just saturation. And then you can also, of course, reset the channel. That's an easy way to do that. Or if you want to bring up the, you can select, of course, a preset, right? So we can go ahead and select a preset or create a preset of our own. We can go in here and just kind of select any of these presets or create one ourselves. Say new preset, and we'll call this custom 1 or something like that. And we'll say done, and so that's always one that will show up at the bottom of that list right there. So that's another another thing that that comes in handy in terms of creating these paint effects. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this. and we'll move on to another hotkey that can be quite useful, as well as another feature that was introduced in 2013, which is flooding from the camera angle. So let's say we'll kind of look at this from this direction. You can see that we now have a view cube. And the nice thing about the view cube in Mudbox is that it actually does allow you very quickly to jump into an orthographic view without having to jump into an orthographic camera. That's very useful when you're painting or sculpting from an X, Y, or a Z direction. So once I get to a view like this, I can just pick a different color and kind of color code this with something like, let's pick something like this. That's good, and we'll say done. Let's isolate the model over here so that we're just looking at one. Let's turn mirroring off for now. We can go ahead and just create a larger brush and just kind of paint on the surface. And let's not paint on specularity. Let's paint on the diffuse. And so there it is. Good. So now I want to go ahead and show you a couple things. One is the ability to be able to flood from the camera. So if I look at this from a front view, for example, I can go to a projection paint, and then down in here we have a new feature in 2013. If we go ahead and drag this up a bit, that says flood from camera. And when you do that, you can see that it just fills or floods the model with that color. Of course, let's go ahead and pick the color. Let's create the color that we set up initially. There we go. You can see how it floods it. Now the other thing that you could do, which is really nice, is if I go in and say I need this to be more useful. So if we go down to the fall off section here, and maybe we'll pick a fall off that's soft like that, but we'll also include something called fall off based facing angles. We're going to go in here and punch in some values. And so what you get with these values is a fall off start angle, meaning that an angle of 15 degrees from the viewing angle, and it kind of explains this in icons here, which you may not be able to see, but the viewing direction of the camera is directly at the model. A 15-degree angle away from that is where you would still be able to see paint. So if I paint this now with 15 degrees of fall off start angle, you can see that we do get paint, but we can paint over certain areas that face away more than 15 degrees, and we're not going to get any paint. That fall off range is kind of a way to control the softness of that transition. If you set that to 0, you would get very harsh angles like that. You get very harsh transitions. And so that's kind of a way to control the softness of that transition. Now we could do this across the model just like that, and it works for any of your brushes, whether you use sculpt brushes, paint brushes, projection brushes, or paint erase brushes. So if I were to go in and say let's select the Minotaur, and I use a paint erase, you can see that it's erasing using those fall off settings. And so in this case, we want to use a softer brush like this and erase the paint just in certain areas. So let's say you have like a plane or a jet or something that moves through the air very quickly, where it's exposed to tiny little particles that kind of wear and erode the leading edges of everything on that surface. You could set up these values and then start to erase and maybe reveal like a metal surface rather than a painted surface underneath. And I'm just showing this on a character right now. So from a front view, what I could do to just kind of capture the entire surface and make it easy for myself is to paint erase and then flood from the camera, and now erase all the leading kind of surfaces that face the camera directly using this kind of technique. So that's just an example of how you could kind of modify fall off, but also flood a surface at once, so you're applying this everywhere from the position, from the viewpoint of the camera. So the last couple of things that I want to talk about here is a hotkey that's useful. So if I have a paintbrush, for example, and I'll lay down some additional paint, let's go ahead and mirror that just to kind of add some detail, add some color maybe in there. I can quickly just lay down some color and then jump into a blur hotkey, the shift key, which is the same hotkey that we use to smooth sculpted surfaces, just to make it consistent. And if I hit shift, you can see that now I can kind of blur this into the rest of the model, and then maybe make it less opaque as well, and kind of make this blend a little bit better. So the blur hotkey is another hotkey that we added. The last thing here that I want to mention under extraction here, so if we go to map extraction and we look at normal maps, we're looking at normal maps, generating normal maps from bumps earlier. In the process of extracting normal maps, we can now go ahead and generate maps that are 32K in size. So we added the 16K and 32K size presets for map extraction.